Welcome to the CEC Report. It's October 19. I'm Robert Barwick and I'm joined by CEC leader Craig Isherwood. Welcome, Craig.
Yeah, thanks, Robbie.
In this week's CEC Report, households in negative equity were lambs to slaughter. Productivity Commission's call for electricity privatisation is not independent. And finally, what is the real Benghazi cover-up? So first, households in negative equity were lambs to slaughter. This week, the JP Morgan Mortgage Industry Report has revealed something quite shocking. 35%, a third, of the households who bought their homes after 2008, Craig, using the increased first home buyers grant, are now in negative equity. They owe more on their mortgages than their properties are worth. And that rate is actually highest in Queensland, where it's 54%. And there's probably, for a homeowner, there's nothing worse than being in negative equity.
Yeah.
How did this come about? Well, effectively, these households were deliberately set up. In 2008, after the GFC erupted September, October, one of the stimulus measures of the Rudd government was a boost to the first home buyers grant to $28,000, and then combined with some state-based grants that got up to as high as $35,000. And remember, before that, it had been $7,000. So that was a huge boost, right? When Rudd announced it, he sold it as a measure to make housing more affordable. However, that wasn't true. Now, there's a book written by Lenore Taylor and David Uren on the GFC, which they called Shitstorm. Apologies for anyone who takes offence at that, but that was the term Rudd used on TV at the time. And in that book, they reveal quite openly that when Rudd and his gang of four took the decision to increase the first home buyers grant, they took that decision with one objective in mind, and that was to increase property prices. They wanted to make housing more expensive because they weren't thinking about the homes, they were thinking about saving the banks.
But creating a property bubble in the process, of course, because by the first homeowners grant had the effect of basically inflating property values across the country. But
quite quickly.
Very quickly, yeah.
Now, because they'd started to go down, let me just give the folks a bit of the history of it.
Yeah.
The thing to understand is Australia's banks are some of the most heavily exposed in the world to mortgages. Right? Most banks have about 25%. Australia's banks all have over, our big four banks all have over 50%. So it's heavily concentrated in this sector of the economy. At that time, and still today, but slightly less, but at that time, the banks were also heavily exposed to their own foreign debt. They had borrowed overseas short-term loans on 90 days, up worth $440 billion, which they'd lend out as in these mortgages, right? So that was, they were caught between both things. Why do we say that the housing was inflated, the prices of the housing was inflated? Simple. There's an historical multiple for housing, which historically over decades has run at 3.5 times, the cost of housing is 3.5 times household income.
The median wage.
Yeah. In Australia, in the first decade of the 21st century, that grew to over 7 times.
In some places, up like the Gold Coast, probably something like 9 times.
Now, Craig, that had happened in many other countries as well, but the thing with all those other countries is that crashed back down to the historical multiple. That's what Australia was faced with. Just as an aside, one of the drivers of this growth was subprime mortgages. Now, we just talked about this a couple of weeks ago here, that this investigation has just shown that Australia did have a big problem with subprime mortgages. We claim we didn't, but we called them a different name, low doc and no doc loans, right? Which were loans that were specifically designed for sole operators of small businesses who didn't have your normal tax returns, etc., that they could get loans. In 2000, 0.8% of all mortgages issued that year were low doc, no doc loans. By 2008, it was 20%. And what banks were doing, of course, was shoveling money out the door to keep people buying property to drive the property prices up. When the GFC hit, all the money for those types of loans dried up. And all of a sudden you had the possibility that without that flood of people into the market, the market would naturally, like every other country in the world, start to crash. So faced with that, what did Rudd do? Well, Rudd had a choice. He could have gone with our legislation. The CEC a year earlier had put forward the Homeowners and Bank Protection Bill as a piece of legislation. We had lobbied councils all around Australia. We had a whole bunch of councils who had endorsed it as a call. The mortgage stress in Australia was huge at the time, right? And we said, here's what should be done. This bill would have saved banks, but more importantly, kept people in their homes. Rudd could have done that. But no, what did he do? He chose to invent a system to lure, is the word for it, lure unsuspecting young home buyers into the market to buy property that they knew was going to be way too expensive for them, and that's what they're finding now. So, Craig, my question for you is, what would you call a government which puts young families into financial hardship in order to shield corporations from losses?
Extremely callous, Robbie, to say the least. I mean, the point is that there's a lot of families now that are bought into these into the scheme, particularly with the homeowners, the initial first homeowners grant, that simply can't get finance anymore. And I've, looking at the report, the JP Morgan report, you find out, basically of 30% of people actively seeking refinance from the first home buyer category, 15% of them can't get finance again, which means that 15% of these people are going to suffer some sort of dislocation where they lose their home or whatever. Now that's interesting because that's directly related to this push for the first homeowners grant in order to inflate the markets. Now we put out the Homeowners and Bank Protection Bill as soon as we heard that we could foresee that this sort of problem was going to happen because, look, the banks in Australia are totally reliant, as you say, on mortgages and the sale of mortgages to keep their assets increasing, but also the cash flow coming in from all those mortgage payments, from the interest rates associated with them and so forth.
Which are often made under extreme hardship.
Yes, and the increase of low doc loans shows you that this was the intention of the banks, is to try and prop up their assets by propping up the value of households. Now, as you said, 54% of homeowners in Queensland are now in negative equity, right? The loan to value ratio of homes, that is, if someone goes to get a loan, the banks look at, okay, what's the loan, what's the value of the property? And because housing prices are falling in Queensland, because of all the economic policies leading to the unemployment, the downturn in the economic circumstances relating to the so-called mining boom and so forth, this is across the board problem, is that housing values are literally falling, as they have everywhere else in the world where similar sorts of bubbles are being created. So we're heading into another shitstorm, to use Rudd's language, here in terms of what young families are are faced with. Now, how do you deal with this? Well, you have to come back and say this should have never happened in the first place. It's fine for people to own homes. It's fine for people to want to own homes. However, you don't turn the home ownership market into a casino for the banks.
Yep.
Just like the entire monetary and financial system globally has been turned into a casino, they are not concerned about the general welfare of the population. And one of the basic economic human rights, to a degree, you could say, is that people have a right to decent housing. Therefore, the government has to protect that right, and that hasn't happened.
And the government should have never used its power, because people who know the subject know that it's government's tax breaks that have encouraged this boom in house prices as well. The government has really betrayed the trust that people have in it, hasn't it, by doing this?
Well, and that's why we suggest in the Homeowners and Bank Protection Bill that there should be an immediate moratorium on all home loans and small business loans relating to family farms. Freeze it. People are not to be evicted. Then reevaluate all those loans based upon deflated property values, and actually keep people in their homes. You're talking about, Robbie, the dislocation of entire communities. Young people, having to leave areas because they can't find cheap rental accommodation, and therefore the schools suffering, the general community suffering. So this is not just an issue about how much money the bank's going to make or lose. It's an issue about the very social fabric of our society, and that principle has to be refought for, which is what we stand for.
And viewers can watch on our website or on YouTube our video, The Homeowners and Bank Protection Bill, The Only Solution, which goes through what we propose to do about that and still do propose. Okay, when we come back, we're going to talk about electricity privatisation. Welcome back to the CEC Report. The Productivity Commission's call for electricity privatisation is not independent. Craig, Australians hate privatisation, and the state of Queensland showed that most recently when that was the reason they voted out the Anna Bligh government. On cue, therefore, along comes the Productivity Commission, this independent body of economic experts who've produced a report demanding it. And they've basically said that they've called for every state which still has state-owned electricity, like New South Wales, Tasmania, Queensland, they should all be privatised. And the Productivity Commission has promised that such privatisation will make electricity cheaper. And I forget the rate, but whatever it is, the big contradiction to that, of course, is the state of Victoria.
Well, it's a very sore point, Robbie, because I mean I've just done an analysis of our own power bills in this office, and I can tell you that our bills have gone from 15.9 cents per kilowatt to 26.3 cents per kilowatt, and the base rate the same rates, and also the management of the meters rate from 50 cents to $1.05. And they're quoting Victoria as the successful model. It's a load of absolute garbage, because we've suffered, it's nearly 100% increase in the price of power. Not 100%, but maybe 70%. I mean, from 53, from what I was saying before, 15.9 to 25, 26. I mean, this is the fraud, because they point to this, and the other fraud is that state-owned utilities are much more expensive to operate than privatised ones.
That's right.
The whole of Victoria and most other states had publicly owned utilities for 100 years. And we never saw the sort of rates of increase in the last 4 years that we're now seeing. Why?
We not only did we not see that, we had the cheapest power in the world.
And I was looking at West Virginia as an example. It's 7 cents per kilowatt hour for power, right? That's nearly 4 times less than what we're paying. Why? It's because that is actually what the rate of power should be. We've seen the privatisation of electricity in Victoria, which means basically the private ownership of formerly publicly owned power utility companies and generation capacity. So what we're now seeing, and what they don't talk about, is that privatisation means pitting the idea of the general welfare of the population, whereby governments step in and regulate basic, crucial economic infrastructure, right? And they provide the finance through government means, which can be
long-term and
low interest, right? Against the interests of privately owned corporations that have only got one concern: profit for their shareholders at all costs.
And they look at utilities, especially, of something like electricity, which we all need. You take electricity out of the equation, you don't have a civilization anymore. It's a captive market, if you will, and they go, how can we get our fangs into that? Because once we've got that, then we can do whatever we like.
Look, it's nothing more than looting. The same as privatised health is looting literally the health of the populations and creating income streams which should never be created. Such it is where these other basic economic infrastructures, whether it be water or power, for example, or even roads. I mean, the toll companies like Macquarie Bank and so forth are ripping huge amounts of profits from people using roads, because it's an easy looting mechanism if you've got a compliant government that believes in the principles of free trade. It's only free for those who can afford it.
And before the GFC, Craig, outfits like Macquarie Bank, which of course is a big player in electricity privatisation too, and Macquarie had a little sister called Babcock and Brown, which was a Macquarie Bank wannabe. They were boasting returns on investment, annual returns of over 40%. Now this is loan shark stuff.
Yeah.
But people were brainwashed to think, oh, that's the new norm. That's what we should expect. Well, you can only do that if you allow these parasites into public systems where the public have no choice but to pay up and literally be milked by these outfits. So this raises the question, though, of the Productivity Commission, because they're supposed to be independent.
No.
But isn't the bottom line here that they are, and this applies, everything they've done, if you look at their history, the Productivity Commission's history, they have demanded economic rationalism or market liberalisation for everything they've looked at. So isn't the reality that under the cover of sort of an academic persona, they are pushing nothing but an extreme right-wing Mont Pelerinite monetarist agenda?
Oh, that's what I was going to say before, because why do people oppose privatisation? Was because it is actually unnatural, Robbie. People expect their government to provide basic economic infrastructure, whether it be health or
it's common sense.
It's common sense, right? That's what governments are there for. But this new beast of economic rationalism is only a new beast relative to the hegemony of economic policy. When you go back to the 1970s and you had the Mont Pelerin Society flooding Australia with various think tanks, the Centre for Independent Studies, the H.R. Nichols Society among them. And we've done a lot of work on this back in 1996 because we were suffering under Kennett reforms here in Victoria. So what you saw was this new raft of ideas based upon pure British free trade, economic rationalism, privatisation and deregulation as a means of looting the public from and looting them to force them in a user-pays system to pay for what they use. And this is foreign. This is not what governments are for. So consequently, there's a backlash, and people don't trust their government that pushes a policy like this because it is a looting policy. End of story.
Yep.
And you only have to look at the most personal aspect of this, which I'll say some more about in another show, is the issue of health. And here in Victoria this last week it's been reported the waiting lists have yet again blown out to something like 47,000 people waiting for elective surgery. And the astonishing thing is you're looking at kids. 700 to 800 of those are kids that urgently need elective surgery that are waiting for it. That is a pure personal reminder of the looting mechanism of this policy. And that's what that's why we've opposed this for nearly 25 years.
Yeah, it's a moral question.
It's a moral question about how you value human beings. So come back to this idea of what does this mean for governments? Like in the first question on homeowners, rights to and the speculation in homes, it's the same issue. You're treating basically people as human cattle and not as actual valuable human beings.
Yeah. All right. When we come back, we're going to talk about what is the real Benghazi cover-up. Welcome back to the CEC Report. Finally, what is the real Benghazi cover-up? So, Craig, as of this morning, Australia is now on the UN Security Council. Woohoo! The question is, what will we do on it?
I don't know yet, Robbie. We'll have to wait and see, I think.
Well, there's a few international issues which are going to be a test. And let's talk about one big one right now. And it's this issue of Benghazi, the attack on the US Embassy in Libya, where it was in the city of Benghazi, which relates to what's now on the world's table in terms of the crisis in Syria. Now, this attack on the embassy in Benghazi and the assassination of America's ambassador there, Chris Stevens, if people have been following the news, that's now a major scandal in the United States, and it's dominating the US presidential election at the moment. For 2 weeks after the attack, Barack Obama insisted on calling it a protest against this anti-Islam video. And then he later on admitted, okay, it was an attack. But those 2 weeks extended into the week of the September when the UN General Assembly was sitting, and Obama gave his speech to the UN General Assembly. And in that speech, he made that speech an attack on Syria, right, and called for international action against Syria and bagged the Russians and the Chinese for stopping it, etc. And in that speech, he still then, 25th of September, 14 days later, called it a protest against the video. Now, this is all shown to be not true. It was a planned terrorist attack by these jihadis that are linked to Al-Qaeda. The Republicans are screaming that it's a cover-up. We're screaming it's a cover-up too, but the Republicans are focusing on one aspect of it, which is the lack of security, because there was a request for security. The ambassador knew that he needed security. He felt targeted, etc., but there was no security forthcoming. That is a scandal, but it's not the real cover-up. The real cover-up of Benghazi is the fact that the jihadi terrorists who conducted the operation, who are linked to Al-Qaeda, they were unleashed by the British and Obama. they work for them.
Against Libya and Gaddafi in the first place.
That was the point. In order to topple Gaddafi, they unleashed these guys into Libya to do the work, and now they're using the same people in Syria. The British and Obama are backing the same people in Syria through their conduits in Saudi Arabia and Qatar, but these people are fundamentalist Muslim terrorists, right? And both sides, the Republicans aren't focusing on this because they are implicit in this agenda. Now, for people's perspective, listen to what Vladimir Putin commented on this on the 3rd of September in an interview to Russian TV channel Russia Today. He pointed out that the architects of US foreign policy in Afghanistan, Libya and Syria, quote, hardly ever think of the consequences that will follow. Putin recalled that the US policy in Afghanistan in 1979, quote, basically gave rise to Al-Qaeda, a United States pet project that later targeted its creator. He continued, quote, today some people want to use militants from Al-Qaeda or some other organisations with equally radical views to accomplish their goals in Syria. But in that case, one should unlock Guantanamo, arm all of its inmates and bring them to Syria to do the fighting. I would like to emphasise that this policy is very short-sighted and is fraught with dire consequences. Now, the bottom line, though, for what Obama has done here in league with the British, is they have, by doing this against Libya and now Syria, this regime change, they have turned the Arab Spring into a region-wide war zone. And the most chilling commentary on it came from Russia's Foreign Minister Lavrov. This was the same day as Obama's speech to the UN General Assembly, September 25th. He was being interviewed on US television. He was asked what he thought about the Arab Spring. And Lavrov said, well, I hope it's not going to the nuclear winter, end quote. So this is an issue that Australia has to decide what we're going to do. Craig, what should Australia use its UN Security Council seat to do?
Immediately dump the Blair Doctrine of the right to protect. Because this is a doctrine that came in, this was the doctrine that was used to dump Gaddafi. It's a doctrine that's allowing people to go into Syria on the idea of pretext of going in to protect the people of Syria against an oppressive regime. That's a completely fraudulent British doctrine and is designed to destroy sovereignty. So Australia should stand up for the principles, or what we call the principle of Westphalia, which is the principle of the advantage of the other. That there is no right for another country to dictate terms to another sovereign country on anything. Discussion, dialogue about principles, about reasons, fine, sure. But to go in with the use or the avocation of military force to change the direction of a sovereign country, like you saw in Libya and other places, is a breach of national sovereignty. And what you unleash are forces that are completely unpredictable, as Vladimir Putin has said. And you just don't have to go back to Afghanistan with the creation of the Mujahideen by the CIA in America in the 70s and the 80s to see this. So the principle of the advantage of the other would be a complete change of direction for the UN Security Council, and that's what we should be talking about at that level. And that will reconfigure, bring us into alignment much more with China and with Russia, I would think.
And for Australians who agree with that, you're probably not going to get this present government to do what Craig just said with the UN. So we better vote them out and vote the CEC in instead. All right, we've run out of time. Look up our website for other information on this, but thanks for tuning in, and tune in next week for more.